I came to the pawn shop to sell old coins for $8, but the next day they called, "Ma'am, come back urgently." Two men in suits said with shaking voices, "Ma'am, do you know how much your coins are actually worth?" Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Patricia Callahan. I was 54 years old when my life changed because of a wooden box I almost threw away. For most of my adult life, I would have described myself as an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in Clarksburg, Ohio, a small town where everybody knows your name, your business, and your car. I had been married to Thomas Callahan for 28 years. Tom was a quiet man, a high school history teacher who spent his weekends tinkering in the garage and attending local coin shows that I never once accompanied him to. I teased him about those coins. I called them his little metal obsession. He would laugh and say, "Patricia, one day you'll understand." I never did. Not until it was too late to tell him he was right. Tom died 8 months before the day I walked into that pawn shop. A heart attack, sudden and total, at 57 years old on a Tuesday morning in February while he was making coffee. I found him on the kitchen floor when I came downstairs. That image, his coffee mug still on the counter, still warm, stayed with me for months afterward in a way I couldn't explain to anyone. After the funeral, the condolence casseroles, and the sympathy cards, I was left with the quiet reality of my finances. Tom had been our primary earner. My part-time work as a school librarian's assistant covered my car payment and groceries, and not much else. What I did not know until I sat down with our accountant was that Tom had accumulated debt. Not reckless debt. He wasn't a gambling man, nothing like that. But quietly compounding debt. A second mortgage refinance he'd taken out to pay for our daughter Lena's college tuition. Credit cards with balances he'd been chipping away at for years. He hadn't hidden it from cruelty. I believe now he was ashamed, and he kept meaning to fix it before I ever had to see it. By October, 8 months after I buried my husband, I was behind on the second mortgage and had received 2 letters from collection agencies. I was not panicking, or I was, but the kind of panic that goes internal and quiet, the kind that makes you function on the surface while something hollow opens up underneath. I was selling things. A dining room set we'd bought together in 1998, Tom's old truck, some tools from the garage, everything legal, everything methodical, everything heartbreaking. That was when I cleared out the storage unit. Tom rented a 10 by 10 unit on the edge of town that I hadn't touched since he died. It was too much too soon. But October came, and I couldn't keep paying the monthly fee, so I drove there on a Saturday with a thermos of coffee and a plan to be efficient. Most of what was in there I already expected. Old textbooks, boxes of documents, fishing equipment, 3 broken lamps I'd asked him to throw away for years. And then, on the top shelf, behind a rolled-up canvas drop cloth, I found a wooden box. It was about the size of a shoebox, latched with a small brass clasp, and it was heavier than I expected. Inside, nestled in a faded red velvet insert with individual oval slots, were coins, old ones, dull silver and dark copper, some so worn the faces were nearly smooth. There was no label, no list, no note from Tom explaining what they were or where he'd gotten them. I sat on a folding chair in that storage unit and looked at those coins for a long time. I didn't feel a connection to them. I didn't feel Tom's presence in them. I felt the weight of a stranger's collection, and I thought, I could probably get something for these. I drove to Ray's Pawn and Trade on Maple Street on a Monday afternoon. I had passed that shop 100 times without ever going inside. It had a hand-painted sign in the window, We buy gold, silver, coins, jewelry, and a small brass bell that jangled when I pushed the door open. The man behind the counter was Raymond Dunmore. He was in his late 60s with pale blue eyes, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the careful stillness of a man who had spent decades watching people walk in with things they needed to sell. He shook my hand and called me ma'am and smiled like someone's grandfather. I set the wooden box on the glass counter. He opened it, looked through the coins. Unhurried, casual, almost bored, he picked up 2 or 3, turned them over, set them back down. The whole inspection took maybe 4 minutes. "These are old," he said. "Circulated, most of them. Worn condition. Honestly, they're not much from a collector's standpoint." He closed the box. "I can give you $8 for the lot." $8? I almost laughed. Then I almost cried. Then I thought about the collection agency letters on my kitchen counter. "Okay," I said. He wrote out a receipt. He counted out $8 bills. I signed. He slid the wooden box under the counter. I drove home. I made dinner. I thought nothing more about it. Until the next morning, when my phone rang. The call came at 9:47 in the morning. I remember the time because I was standing at the kitchen sink with my second cup of coffee, watching the neighbor's dog dig a hole in the yard next door, and I glanced at the microwave clock automatically when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but it had a local area code. "Mrs. Callahan?" A man's voice, professionally neutral. "This is Ray Dunmore from Ray's Pawn and Trade. I'm sorry to bother you, but something's come up regarding the items you sold yesterday. It's a bit urgent. Would you be able to come back in today?" I asked if something was wrong. He said he'd rather explain in person. He said it again. Urgent. His voice had a quality I couldn't immediately identify. A careful stillness, like a man choosing every word with a great deal of attention. I went. "I want to tell you what I was thinking on the 15-minute drive over. I was thinking maybe I'd left something in the shop. Maybe there was a problem with the receipt. Maybe one of the coins was stolen property somehow and the police were involved, and I was about to have a very bad morning for an entirely different reason." I went through a dozen scenarios. Not one of them was close to what actually waited for me. When I walked through the door with the brass bell, Ray was not alone. 2 men were standing near the counter, and they were so conspicuously out of place in that small-town pawn shop that I stopped walking for a moment. They were wearing suits, not the suits of local businessmen, not the kind of navy blue with a slightly loose fit that you see at Clarksburg's bank branches. These were tailored suits, the charcoal and dark blue kind that meant someone had spent serious money on them. Both men were in their 50s, and both of them looked at me when I walked in with an expression I can only describe as alert. Carefully, professionally alert. "Mrs. Callahan," Ray said, "thank you for coming. These gentlemen are from Midwest Numismatic Associates in Chicago. This is Mr. Philip Crane and Mr. David Hartwell. They had some questions about the items you brought in." Philip Crane stepped forward and shook my hand. His grip was firm and dry. He had the manner of someone accustomed to delivering large pieces of information slowly to let them land correctly. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I want to ask you first. Do you know where those coins originally came from? Were they a family collection or an estate?" I told him they had been my late husband's, that I'd found them in his storage unit, that I knew nothing about coins at all. He nodded. He glanced at his colleague. Something passed between them. "Mrs. Callahan," Philip Crane said, "I'll be straightforward with you. Among the coins in that box, there is one piece that is extraordinarily significant. It is an 1804 draped bust silver dollar." He said the name as if I should recognize it. I didn't. There are 15 confirmed examples of that coin in existence, he continued. 15 in the world. Your coin, the coin that was in that box, is in what we would call very fine condition, exceptional surfaces for the date. At current market values, a coin in that condition would conservatively be expected to realize between $180,000 and $250,000 at a major auction. The room did something strange. It seemed to compress and then expand, and I heard my own heartbeat in my ears for a moment. "I'm sorry," I said. "How much?" "Conservatively, Mrs. Callahan, $180,000, possibly more." I looked at Ray Dunmore. He was standing slightly apart from the two men, and he was not looking at me. He was looking at the glass display case beside the register, his hands folded in front of him, his jaw set in a careful, patient stillness. He did not look ashamed. He looked like a man who had prepared himself for this moment. "I want my coins back," I said. It was the first thing I said that was entirely automatic, entirely without planning. Ray finally looked at me. "Mrs. Callahan, I appreciate that this is a surprise, but the sale was final. You signed the receipt." I asked him if he knew what the coins were worth when he bought them. He said he was a pawnbroker, not a numismatist, and he'd made a good faith assessment. He said it flatly, like a man reciting something he'd rehearsed. I drove home on pure instinct because I don't remember a single turn. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. I did not cry immediately. The feeling was too big for crying. It was more like standing on the edge of something enormous and trying to understand its size. $180,000. Against my debts, against my daughter's school loans, against the second mortgage, against the collection agency letters, $180,000 would have meant a different life. A life without this particular fear, and I had sold it for $8. Then I went inside and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought, did he know? Did he look at those coins and recognize what they were and smile at me with those grandfather eyes and hand me $8 bills? The more I sat with it, the more certain I became. The careful look, the 4 minutes that hadn't seemed bored at all, that had seemed like a performance of boredom. The way he'd called so urgently the next morning, which made no sense if he simply wanted to explain an honest mistake. Why would he call me back at all? Why not keep quiet and sell the coin himself? Unless there was a legal risk he was trying to manage. Unless he needed something from me. I thought about what I had. A receipt for $8. A signature. And the absolute conviction that I had been deliberately cheated. That night, I searched the internet for 3 hours. Consumer fraud, fraudulent misrepresentation, pawnshop laws in Ohio. And in the morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Margaret Ossie, and the paralegal who answered the phone at her office told me she specialized in consumer fraud and civil litigation. I got an appointment for the following Thursday. The office was 40 minutes from Clarksburg in a clean brick building in Columbus, and Margaret Ossie herself was not what I'd pictured. She was in her early 40s, black, with natural hair pinned neatly back, and she wore no jewelry except small gold studs in her ears. She had the kind of direct attention that makes you feel, for the first time in weeks, that someone is actually listening to what you're saying rather than waiting for their turn to speak. I laid everything out on her desk. The storage unit, the wooden box, the trip to Ray's on Monday, the receipt for $8, the call on Tuesday, the 2 men in suits and the number they'd said, $180,000, conservatively. Margaret let me finish without interrupting. Then she wrote something on a yellow legal pad and looked up. "Do you have the receipt?" I did. I'd kept it in my purse since the day I signed it. some instinct refusing to let me throw it away even before I understood why. She looked at it carefully. In Ohio, a claim of fraudulent misrepresentation requires proving that the other party made a false statement of fact, that they knew it was false, and that you reasonably relied on it to your detriment. The difficult part in pawnshop cases like this is proving the seller's knowledge. She set the receipt down. Mr. Dunmore will simply say he had no idea what he was looking at. He'll say it was an honest assessment. Can I prove he's lying? I asked. That depends entirely on what the evidence shows, Margaret said. That's where we'd start, finding out if there's any way Ray Dunmore identified that coin before you walked in. She told me to write down everything I could remember about the interaction in the shop, every detail, how long he'd looked at each coin, what he'd said, whether he'd made any phone calls. I went home and wrote 4 pages in a notebook. The next step Margaret suggested was practical and unglamorous, online research. Rare coin collectors, she explained, often used internet forums and private groups to identify pieces. If Ray had recognized the coin and was uncertain about what he had, there was a chance he'd reached out to someone online before or after my visit. I want to say I found it immediately and it was like a movie moment. It wasn't. It took me 4 evenings of searching, learning the names of numismatic forums I'd never heard of, learning terminology, bust dollar, draped bust, die variety, and slowly understanding the world Tom had loved that I'd never entered. And then, on the 4th evening, I found it. On a forum called Coin Talk, a large active community of collectors and dealers, a user with the handle Raid Ohio had posted 11 days before I walked into Ray's Pawn and Trade. The post was in a subforum called What Do I Have? And it included 2 photographs. The photographs showed both sides of a large silver coin, worn on the surfaces, but clearly detailed enough to identify. The post read, "Found this in a lot I picked up locally. Anyone know what I'm looking at? Looks old." By the next morning, 3 separate users had replied. The first said, "That looks like it could be an 1804 bust dollar. Obverse die is consistent. Where did you get it?" The second had said, "If that's what it looks like, you need to get it professionally graded immediately. Could be significant." The third had replied with more caution, asking for better photographs, but had used the words, "potentially very rare." I sat staring at my laptop screen with my hands flat on the table on either side of it. Raid Ohio had never responded to those replies. But 11 days later, I had walked into a shop with a wooden box. I forwarded everything to Margaret that night. Screenshots of the forum thread, the post date, the username, the coin photographs. She called me the next morning, and even through the phone I could hear the change in her voice. Not excitement. Margaret didn't do excitement, but a focused, taut energy that I'd come to recognize as her equivalent of it. "This is significant," she said. "Not conclusive yet, but significant. We need to tie the username to Dunmore definitively, and we need to find out who he contacted after he saw those replies." What we didn't know yet, what I would only discover later, was that across town, in the back office of Ray's Pawn and Trade, a very different conversation was already happening. Derek Dunmore, Ray's son, was 29 years old and managed all of the shop's online presence, including its private listings on numismatic dealer networks. He was the one who had originally set up the Raid Ohio account, and he was the one who had, just the day before Margaret sent her formal demand letter to Ray's shop, told his father, "Dad, she hired a lawyer. I think she found something." Ray had gone quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Find out what she knows." Margaret filed the civil lawsuit on a Wednesday in November. The claim was for fraudulent misrepresentation and unjust enrichment, and it named Raymond Thomas Dunmore as the sole defendant. It sought the return of the wooden box and all its contents, plus damages for the lost market value of the coin and emotional distress. I don't know exactly when Ray received the paperwork, but it must have been fast because by Saturday morning, Derek Dunmore was parked in front of my house. I saw the truck from the window, a black pickup, late model, idling at the curb for a moment before the engine cut. I didn't know it was Derek at first. I came to the front door and opened it before he reached the porch steps, because I had learned in 54 years that being inside when trouble arrives does not make it go away. He was tall, broader than his father, with his father's pale eyes and a younger face. He wore a work jacket and jeans, and he carried himself with the specific energy of a man who expects to be listened to. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He did not try to come up. "I'm Derek Dunmore, Ray's son. I thought maybe we could have a conversation." I said he could have Margaret O'C's phone number. He made a small, patient sound, not quite a laugh. "Look, I understand you're upset. I do. But you need to understand what you're actually doing here. You're suing a small business. A family business. My dad's been on that street for 30 years. You signed a legal document of sale for $8 that you accepted freely. Now you've got some lawyer telling you there's millions to be made, and 180,000, I said, not millions, and your father knew." He looked at me for a moment, and something moved through his expression, something that was not quite calculation and not quite contempt, but something between the two. "My father is a pawnbroker. He's not a rare coin expert. He made a reasonable offer based on his best assessment. That's the law, Mrs. Callahan. That is literally the law." "Then you have nothing to worry about," I said. He put one foot on the bottom porch step. Not climbing, just a shift in posture. "I'm trying to save you some trouble. This lawsuit is going to cost you money you don't have. We'll countersue for harassment. We'll drag this out for 2 years, and in the end, you'll have spent more than $8 fighting for something that was a legal, documented sale." He let that sit in the air between us for a moment. Then he said more quietly, "You just lost your husband. You've got real financial problems. Is this really how you want to spend the next 2 years of your life?" That was the moment I understood who I was dealing with. Not just a son defending his father's business, a young man who had come to my house, to my home, to use my grief and my debt as a weapon. "Get off my property," I said. "I mean that literally. Step off my porch step." He held my eyes for a beat too long, then stepped back. "Think carefully," he said as he turned toward his truck. I watched him drive away. Then I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote down everything: the time, his exact words, the foot on the step, the reference to my husband, to my finances, to the 2-year timeline. I wrote it all in the same notebook I'd used to document the pawnshop visit. Then I called Margaret. She listened without interrupting. "This is actually helpful," she said, and I heard the focused quality in her voice again. "Unauthorized contact with a represented party, potential witness intimidation, document everything. Send me what you wrote tonight." The following Monday, Margaret filed an additional motion noting Derek's visit as potential witness tampering. It didn't immediately change anything legally, but it established a record. What it did do immediately was make Ray's lawyer, a man named Clifford Baum, call Margaret and ask her to manage her client's aggression. Margaret told me about this with perfect composure, and I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. But the encounter with Derek had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I lay awake that Sunday night in my very quiet house, listening to nothing, and felt the full weight of what I had gotten into. These were not distant abstractions, a lawsuit, a claim, a court date. These were people with a truck and a physical presence and a father's 30-year reputation to protect. And I was doing this essentially alone, in a town where Ray Dunmore had been a fixture for 3 decades, and I was a newly widowed woman who had sold a coin for $8. My sister Janet lived in Columbus. She had been asking me for 2 months to come stay for a few days. I called her Monday evening and said I was coming Thursday through Sunday. She said, "Finally." I packed a bag, drove 40 minutes, and spent 4 days sleeping in her guest room, letting her cook for me, watching bad television, and not thinking about coins or lawyers or pale blue eyes at the bottom of porch steps. I needed it. I needed those 4 days the way you need water, not as a luxury, but as a basic requirement for continuing. I came back on Monday morning. I was ready. The settlement offer arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after my stay in Columbus. It was written in the careful, bloodless language of legal correspondence. But the number was there in plain black ink. $5,000, offered as a full and final settlement, with a mutual non-disparagement agreement, meaning I would agree never to speak publicly about any aspect of the transaction. I stood in my hallway with the letter in my hands and thought about what $5,000 would actually do for me. It would bring the second mortgage current. It would pay the collection agencies into silence for a few months. It would buy me a winter without that specific, grinding financial anxiety. And it would end this: the lawyer calls, the documented threats, the sleepless nights, the feeling of walking around with a target on my back in a town where everyone knew the Dunmores. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't tempted. I sat with that letter for a long time. What pulled me back was a very simple piece of arithmetic. Philip Crane from Midwest Numismatic Associates had said $180,000, conservatively. They were offering me $5,000. They were offering me less than 3% of the coin's minimum value in exchange for my silence. What does it mean when a man offers you $5,000 to be quiet? It means the thing you're being quiet about is worth a great deal more than $5,000. It means they were afraid. I called Margaret and told her to decline. There was a brief pause on her end, and then, "Good. I'll send the rejection letter today." It was around this time that I found the Coin Club. Tom had been a member of the Clarksburg Numismatic Society for 11 years. I knew this in the abstract way you know things about your spouse's hobbies. A line on his schedule, occasional Saturday mornings, a few men whose names I'd heard. After Tom died, the club's president, a man named Carl Whitfield, had sent a very kind handwritten note of condolence. I had responded briefly and thought that was the end of it. But when I mentioned the lawsuit to my neighbor Sandra, who knew everything about everyone, she looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Patricia, those coin men adored Tom. You should call Carl." I called Carl Whitfield on a Wednesday evening, half expecting an awkward conversation with a near stranger about my dead husband's hobby. Instead, Carl, a retired accountant in his late 60s, precise and warm, listened to the whole story and was silent for a moment at the end. "Patricia," he said, "there are people in this club who need to know about this. Would you be willing to come to a meeting?" I went the following Thursday to a meeting room in the back of the public library. There were 14 members present, ranging from a man in his 80s who collected ancient Roman coins to a woman in her 30s who specialized in commemorative American silver. They listened to my story around a folding table, and when I finished, the room was very quiet. Then Harold Finch spoke. Harold was 73, small and precise-featured, with a white mustache and the careful hands of a man who spent a great deal of time handling small, valuable objects. He was, several members later told me, one of the most respected numismatists in the state of Ohio. He had been appraising coins for 40 years. He had consulted for the Smithsonian and for heritage auctions. "I knew Tom," Harold said. "He bought that $1804 from an estate sale in Zanesville 4 years ago. Paid $400 for it, which was remarkable luck. He showed it to me once. I told him then what it was. He said he was going to have it professionally graded and then decide what to do." Harold paused. "I'm sorry we never finished that conversation." The room was quiet again. "Mrs. Callahan," Harold said, "I would like to write a formal appraisal letter, and if it goes to court, I would be honored to serve as your expert witness." I had to look at the table for a moment. It wasn't just the practical value of what he was offering, though that was enormous. It was the feeling of not being alone in it anymore. Tom had a whole world I'd never entered, and that world had just turned toward me like a hand extended in a dark room. Harold's formal appraisal letter arrived at Margaret's office the following week. It confirmed the coin's identity, its grade, and its estimated market value at $195,000 minimum based on comparable auction results. It was 6 pages, single-spaced, with footnotes. Margaret called it the kind of document that makes opposing counsel reconsider their life choices. Ray Dunmore, I had no doubt, was informed of it immediately. Good. They came on a Sunday afternoon, which I thought was deliberate. Sundays in Clarksburg are quiet, the kind of quiet that makes visitors conspicuous. I was in the backyard raking leaves when I heard the doorbell. I came around the side of the house and found Ray and Derek Dunmore standing on my front porch together. Ray was holding a paper bag from the bakery 2 streets over. He was wearing a fleece jacket and a baseball cap, and he looked like someone's grandfather stopping by to apologize for a misunderstanding. Derek stood slightly behind him, hands in his jacket pockets, face arranged in something that was trying to be neutral, but wasn't quite achieving it. I stopped on the front walkway and looked at them from a distance of about 10 feet. I did not open the porch gate. "Patricia," Ray said, "I hope you don't mind us stopping by. I brought some pastries from Mercer's." He half lifted the bag, like an offering. "My attorney's name is Margaret Osey," I said. "All communication goes through her." Ray made a small, regretful sound, the sound of a reasonable man being met with unreasonable resistance. I know that's how it has to be officially. I felt like I owed you a personal conversation. We've been neighbors in this town for years, you and Tom and me. This all got so formal so fast, and I feel awful about that." He had the voice for it, warm, a little tired, carrying the weight of a man who hated conflict. If I hadn't found the forum post, if I hadn't spent 3 weeks going over every word of every interaction, I might have softened. I would have. I am not, by nature, a hard person. "What do you want, Ray?" I asked. He set the bakery bag down on the porch railing, a giving-up gesture, an honest-now gesture. "I want to make this right. I've talked to my lawyer, and I know this is going to get messy for everyone if it goes to court. I want to offer you $15,000. I know it's not what the experts are saying the coin is worth, but these appraisals are always speculative. Auction results vary. Condition disputes happen at grading. $15,000 is real money right now, no legal fees, no stress. $15,000, more than the first offer, still less than 10%. "No," I said. Derek shifted his weight. Ray's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Patricia," Ray said more quietly, "I think you're underestimating how hard this will be for you. Court cases are expensive. They're exhausting. And he paused, and something careful entered his voice. Tom had some financial situations that are going to come up in discovery. Debts to local businesses, a loan he took from a private party that wasn't fully documented. I don't want any of that coming out in a public proceeding. I don't think you want that either. Tom was a well-respected man in this town. There it was, a cold, precise, deliberate thing, dressed up in the warm voice of a grandfather. I had known it was coming. Known it since Derek had stood on my porch step 3 weeks ago and mentioned my husband. I had known they would use Tom eventually, his debt, his reputation, his name, and knowing it was coming did not, in that moment, make it land any softer. My chest tightened, and something hot moved up the back of my throat, but I breathed through it, one slow breath. Who do you want to be right now? Tom's finances will be fully handled in court, I said. My voice was level. My attorney is very good. As for his reputation, Tom spent 28 years being a decent, honest, hard-working man. I'm not afraid of what discovery finds. Are you? Ray looked at me for a long moment. The grandfather warmth had gone out of his expression entirely. What was left was just a face, older than it looked in its warm moments, more calculating, the pale eyes without friendliness now. You should think carefully, he said, and the phrasing was almost exactly what Derek had said 3 weeks ago on this same porch. I have thought carefully, I said. Please leave my property. Derek took a step forward, not threatening exactly, but pointed. You're making a mistake. That's my right, I said. They left. Ray picked up the pastry bag. He paused at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back at me once, but I was already watching them from behind the gate with my arms crossed, and there was nothing in my face that gave him anything to work with. I waited until the black truck was out of sight. Then I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and allowed myself to shake for exactly 5 minutes. Just the hands, mostly. The physical release of adrenaline I hadn't let myself show. Then I called Margaret. I told her everything. The bakery bag, the $15,000, the specific comment about Tom's debts, the phrase, not fully documented. She wrote it all down and told me it was the second incident of unauthorized direct contact with a represented party. It was also, she said carefully, something that could look very much like intimidation using privileged information. If they were obtaining information about Tom's estate through improper channels, that was its own problem. They're scared, she said. This is what scared people do. I knew she was right, and knowing they were scared helped me, more than I'd expected it to. Fear in an adversary is information. It tells you that the ground you're standing on is solid, even when it doesn't feel solid. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The trial date was set for a Thursday in February, almost exactly 1 year after Tom died on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen. I noticed the symmetry and said nothing about it to anyone. The Franklin County Courthouse was larger and grayer than I'd imagined from the outside, and the courtroom itself had the particular institutional quiet of a place where important things happen in ordinary ways. Margaret was precise and calm at the plaintiff's table. I sat beside her and kept my hands folded in my lap and tried to breathe the way she had advised me. Slowly, through the nose, on the exhale especially. Clifford Baum, Ray's lawyer, was in his 60s, silver-haired, and had the practiced confidence of a man who had won cases by outlasting people. He opened his defense with exactly the argument Margaret had predicted. Ray Dunmore was a pawnbroker, not a numismatist. He had made an assessment in good faith. The plaintiff had entered the transaction freely and with no coercion. The signed receipt was a legal contract, and the matter ended there. It was a reasonable argument. It would have been sufficient against a weaker case. Margaret began with Harold Finch. Harold took the stand in a dark suit and spoke with the careful precision of a man who had spent 40 years being correct about things. He explained what an 1804 draped bust silver dollar was. He explained why 15 of them existed. He explained in clear, accessible language that anyone with genuine expertise in American coinage who examined this coin for more than 30 seconds would have identified it, not as certainly as a grading service, but as something requiring immediate further investigation. No experienced coin dealer in the United States, Harold said, could look at this piece for 4 minutes and form the sincere belief that it was worth $8. Baum cross-examined him vigorously. Harold didn't move. Then Margaret moved to evidence. She presented the Coin Talk forum post. Baum objected. Authentication, foundation, chain of evidence. The judge, a compact woman in her 50s, named Judge Carol Whitmore, had clearly read the filings. She overruled the objection methodically and allowed the post into evidence. Margaret walked the court through the timeline. The post, dated 11 days before Patricia Callahan walked in. The 3 replies, all identifying the coin within 24 hours. The username Raid Ohio, traced through forum registration records to an IP address registered to the business premises of Ray's Pawn and Trade on Maple Street. Then she presented the email. This was the piece I hadn't known about until Margaret told me 3 weeks before trial. During the discovery process, Ray's business emails had been subpoenaed. Among them was an email sent from Ray's business account to the professional inquiry line at Midwest Numismatic Associates, the firm that Philip Crane and David Hartwell represented, dated 10 days before Patricia's visit. The email included an attached photograph of the 1804 dollar and a brief inquiry. "Can you tell me what this is? May have a live piece. Need quick turnaround." Midwest Numismatic Associates had replied the following day, confirming the coin's likely identity and recommending immediate professional grading. Ray Dunmore had contacted the same firm whose representatives appeared in his shop the day after he bought the coin. He had not contacted them for the first time after the purchase. He had contacted them before Patricia ever walked through his door. When Ray took the stand, his silver-haired lawyer's preparation showed. He answered carefully, patiently, in measured sentences. Yes, he posted on online forums sometimes when he had interesting pieces. It was common in the industry. No, he hadn't fully read the replies before Patricia came in. The forum had many posts and he didn't always follow up. The email to Midwest Numismatic. Well, he had a lot of email inquiries going at any one time. He couldn't be expected to recall everyone. Margaret approached with the printed email chain in her hand. "Mr. Dunmore, this email from your business address to Midwest Numismatic Associates was sent on March 12th. Mrs. Callahan came to your shop on March 22nd. Is that correct?" "If that's what the dates say." The photograph attached to this email, can you identify what coin that is a photograph of? A pause. It appears to be a silver dollar. Does it appear to be the same coin that Mrs. Callahan brought into your shop on March 22nd? Another pause. Baum started to object and thought better of it. "It could be a similar coin," Ray said. "Mr. Dunmore, you testified earlier that you had no specific reason to believe the coin was particularly valuable at the time of purchase, but you sent a photograph of this coin to a numismatic specialist firm for rapid identification 10 days before Mrs. Callahan's visit. How did you have this photograph 10 days before she came in?" Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room. Ray Dunmore opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at his lawyer. Boehm was writing something on his legal pad with focused attention that was, I was fairly certain, a performance of calm. I may have come across the coin before, Ray said carefully, from another seller. Another seller? Margaret said. Can you tell me the name of that seller? He could not. Can you provide any documentation of this prior acquisition, a receipt, a record of payment? He could not. So your testimony is that you obtained a photograph of this specific coin, a photograph that Midwest Numismatic Associates confirmed depicts an 1804 draped bust silver dollar of significant value from an unidentified seller for whom you have no records, 10 days before a widow brought you a wooden box of her late husband's coins and you offered her $8 for the lot. Baum objected. Judge Whitmore sustained the form of the objection and asked Margaret to rephrase. But it didn't matter. The question was already in the room. It would not leave. Derek was called as a witness. He had prepared better than his father. He was younger, steadier. He said he managed the forum account, that his father sometimes asked him to post photos. He said the email to Midwest Numismatic had been sent by him on behalf of the business as part of routine market research, and that his father hadn't necessarily been aware of the reply. Margaret had one question. She showed him a second email, an internal email from Derek's personal account to Ray's business account, dated March 13th, the day after the initial Midwest Numismatic reply. The email contained a forwarded copy of the firm's identification and read in full, "Dad, looks like this is the real thing. What do you want to do?" Derek went very still. "Is this your email address?" Margaret asked. "Yes," he said. "Is this your father's email address?" "Yes." "So you did in fact inform your father of Midwest Numismatic's identification of the coin on March 13th, 9 days before Mrs. Callahan came to the shop." The room was perfectly quiet. I may have sent that," Derek said. "Is there anything unclear about the email?" "Nothing unclear. Nothing at all." Judge Carol Whitmore issued her ruling from the bench on the final day of proceedings, without recessing for deliberation. I had not expected that. I had thought there would be days, maybe weeks, of waiting. But Judge Whitmore had clearly made up her mind during the trial itself, and she was not a woman who saw the value in delay. "The court finds," she said in the even, measured voice she had used throughout the entire proceedings, "that the defendant Raymond Dunmore made a deliberate and materially false statement of fact when he represented to the plaintiff that the contents of the wooden box were worth $8, at a time when he possessed documentation confirming that at least one item in the collection was potentially worth in excess of $100,000. The court finds that this representation was made knowingly, with intent to induce the plaintiff's reliance on it, and that the plaintiff did rely on it, to her significant financial detriment. She paused and looked directly at Ray Dunmore. The court orders the immediate return of all items contained in the wooden box sold by Patricia Callahan to the defendant on March 22nd. The court further orders the defendant to pay compensatory damages in the amount of $45,000, representing the plaintiff's documented financial harm, legal costs, and emotional distress damages as supported by the record. The question of punitive damages is deferred pending the outcome of referral to the Ohio Department of Commerce for review of the defendant's dealer license. The court is further issuing a referral to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for review of potential criminal fraud charges. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where the courtroom was absolutely still. Then Clifford Baum leaned to say something quietly to Ray, and Ray's face, which had been carefully composed throughout the trial, did something I can only describe as collapsing inward. Not dramatically. Just a settling, a slight loosening of all the careful control, and underneath it, a very old man who had made a very consequential decision and now had to live in its result. I did not feel triumph. Not in that moment. I felt something quieter, a kind of deep exhale, the release of a breath I hadn't known I was holding for 4 months. Margaret put her hand briefly on my forearm and said simply, "Well done." The wooden box was released from court custody and returned to me within the week. I drove to Margaret's office to collect it. I held it in my lap in the car in the parking lot for a few minutes before I drove home. Inside was the 1804 draped bust silver dollar, along with everything else. The worn copper cents, the modest silver coins Tom had collected over years, the full small world he had built in an oval slotted velvet box without ever explaining it to me. Margaret connected me with Heritage Auctions in Dallas. The consignment process took 6 weeks. Grading, photography, catalog listing. The coin was graded VF30 by PCGS. It was listed in their spring coin auction with an estimate of $175,000, $220,000. It sold for $212,000. After Heritage's commission and Margaret's fees, which she had reduced significantly as a matter of personal principle, she told me, because she found the case satisfying, I walked away with just over $190,000. $190,000 from a wooden box I had almost left in a storage unit. The rest of the collection, Tom's carefully curated years of purchases, I did not sell. Margaret had Harold Finch appraise everything. The remaining coins totaled approximately $8,400 in collector value, nothing world-changing. But they were Tom's, and I kept them. As for Ray's pawn and trade, the Ohio Department of Commerce investigation found 2 other transactions in the past 5 years in which Ray had purchased items from private sellers at prices demonstrably below market value, with evidence that he had prior knowledge of the item's worth. His dealer license was revoked in April. The Franklin County Prosecutor's Office declined to pursue criminal charges, citing prosecutorial discretion and Ray's age. He was 68 by then, with no prior criminal record. This bothered me for a while. Margaret told me that was normal, and that civil judgment at this scale carried its own weight. She was right. Within 3 months of the ruling, Ray closed the shop. The hand-painted sign, "We buy gold, silver, coins, jewelry," came down from the window. The building went up for lease. I drove past it twice in that period and felt nothing particular each time. Derek lost his position at Clarksburg Community Bank when his employer, conducting a standard background review, discovered the civil fraud case and its findings. He was not charged criminally either, but the court record was public, and public records have a long memory. I did not plan that outcome, I did not pursue it, but I did not mourn it. I paid off the second mortgage in full on a Thursday in May at the bank on Clarksburg's Main Street. The loan officer processed the final payment without comment. I signed the last form. I watched the balance go to 0 on the screen. I walked out into the spring sunshine and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought, Tom would have had something to say about this. Something quiet and accurate and probably funny. I bought the house outright. The house Tom and I had lived in for 22 years. In my own name alone. No mortgage, no second lien, nothing. I paid off every debt Tom had left behind in certified funds, with Margaret sending letters confirming each payoff. I wanted every trace of that particular fear erased from my life. With what remained, I did 3 things. First, I created the Thomas Callahan Memorial Scholarship at Clarksburg Community College. $5,000 per year, awarded to a history student demonstrating financial need. Carl Whitfield and several members of the Coin Club attended the small ceremony. Second, I had Tom's remaining coins conserved and cataloged by Harold Finch, who refused payment and organized each piece into archival holders with detailed descriptions of where Tom had acquired it. The result was a proper collection, a record of years of quiet passion, and I kept it in a display case in the living room where I could see it every day. Third, I joined the Clarksburg Numismatic Society as a full member. I did not become an expert, but I learned enough to have conversations, what to look for, what questions to ask, when to call Harold. I learned to hold a coin the way Tom had held them, between thumb and forefinger at the rim, tilted toward the light, reading what it had survived. The club meetings became something I genuinely looked forward to. Harold and I had coffee on Wednesdays. Carl Whitfield and his wife had me over for Thanksgiving dinner. My daughter Lena came home for Christmas with her partner, and for the first time in 2 years, I was not worried about the groceries for a proper holiday dinner. I made everything from scratch. It was the best Christmas I could remember. As for Raymond Dunmore, he moved to Columbus to be near Derek after the shop closed. He did not pay the civil judgment promptly, and eventually a collection action enforced a payment schedule through the court. I heard at some point that his health had declined. I did not feel satisfaction at the news, only the awareness that he had made choices that led him here, and those choices had consequences I hadn't manufactured. I had simply stopped protecting him from them. Derek was working at a warehouse distribution center in Columbus. His name remained in the public court record, connected to a civil fraud finding, and that did not disappear. I did not think about him often. When I did, I mostly thought about the moment he'd stood on my porch step and told me to think carefully, as if thinking carefully were something he himself had done. What they had never understood was this. They had read me as a target, a woman alone, recently bereaved, financially vulnerable, without connections to Tom's world. They had been wrong about every single thing. I thought about Tom on the quiet evenings, looking at his coins in the lamplight. He had kept that $1804 for 4 years, knowing what it was, not quite ready to let it go. He never quite got to decide what it meant to him, but in the end, it found its meaning. It turned out they were worth quite a lot.